In just 3 years, from 1943 to 1946, a trio of titans, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, reshaped the post-war world. Their alliance, born of necessity, concealed simmering tensions, since each man aimed to impose his own vision of the global order. Through the Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam Conferences, they redrew borders, upended nations, and unwittingly planted the seeds of a new, deadly rivalry that would grip the world for decades. Dark words from Winston Churchill about an Iron Curtain soon echoed across the globe, revealing how one conflict's end fueled another's beginning. In that brief historical window, entire regions were recast, laying the groundwork for an ideological clash poised to eclipse all past wars. How did these leaders, each with distinct plans, manage to shape a worldwide map for lasting peace? What drove them, and at what cost? And where did they fail? By late 1943, the Allies had scored significant victories, yet still faced the Nazi war machine at its fiercest. In North Africa, Axis forces surrendered in May, clearing the way for the invasion of Sicily that July. With the island secured by mid-August, Allied troops landed in mainland Italy that September. Although Mussolini had been disposed and jailed, Germany held firm in southern and central Italy, maintaining a strong line along the Winter Line, including the Gustav Line near Monte Cassino, far from the Gothic Line, which would come into play in 1944. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army seized momentum after its triumph at Stalingrad and began retaking territory. That summer, Soviet forces repelled Germany's last major offensive at Kursk and pushed onward through Ukraine, dealing severe blows to the Wehrmacht. In this setting, Allied leaders chose Tehran in Iran for their first face-to-face meeting because it lay close to Soviet territory and, although loosely under Allied control, still provided relative security. Churchill, charismatic and combative, arrived with crates of cigars and whiskey, while President Roosevelt, though physically waning, strove to appear strong and upbeat. Stalin watched his counterparts with cool calculation, fully aware of his leverage thanks to Soviet gains on the Eastern Front. He strongly pressed for the immediate opening of a second front in Western Europe.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
The Teheran Conference marked a turning point in Allied collaboration. The Big Three convened face-to-face to orchestrate a global strategy aimed at crushing Nazi Germany. At the heart of their plans lay Operation Overlord, the long-anticipated invasion of France, slated for mid-1944. In return, Stalin pledged to launch a major offensive in the east, coordinating with the Western Allies to keep German forces split between two fronts. Military matters were not the only concern. The Allies agreed to support Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, reaffirmed Iran's post-war sovereignty, and weighed Turkey's potential entry against the Axis. They also floated ideas for occupying or carving up Germany to prevent a future resurgence. One of the most contentious issues was Poland's borders. Stalin demanded the Curzon Line in the east, formally annexing territories the USSR had seized in 1939, and proposed compensating Poland with German lands, stretching to what would become the Oder-Neisse Line. Roosevelt and Churchill did not formally endorse this shift, but refrained from rejecting it, setting the stage for drastic changes in Central Europe. Yet the fragility of Allied unity emerged during a private dinner after the second plenary session. Stalin suggested executing 50,000 German officers to prevent the reformation of a potent German army. Horrified, Churchill declared Britain would never condone such slaughter. He would sooner face a firing squad himself. A misplaced joke from Roosevelt, compounded by his son Elliot's agreement, infuriated Churchill, who stormed out in outrage. Though united by a common foe, Tehran revealed profound, near irreconcilable rifts over how to remake Europe once victory drew near. By early 1945, Nazi Germany appeared on the verge of collapse. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin gathered at Yalta, on Crimea's southern coast, in the Levadia Palace, once the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II. Though palm trees and sea breezes surrounded them, the decisions made here would shape Europe for decades. Their immediate focus was Germany. The Allies agreed on 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with Berlin likewise divided. Demilitarization and denazification were mandatory policies. War reparations proved contentious. They formed a new commission to decide how much Germany would pay, especially to the war-ravaged Soviet Union. Another core topic was establishing the United Nations, designed to prevent future global conflicts. Building on earlier ideas, the leaders solidified a Security Council with 5 permanent members, each wielding veto power, a system with far-reaching consequences. Lauded as an Allied triumph, Yalta nevertheless revealed each leader's unique post-war vision. Beneath polite exteriors, the seeds of conflict had already taken root. No issue at Yalta proved more divisive than Poland. Stalin, as at Tehran, insisted on recognizing the Curzon Line as the eastern boundary, legitimizing Soviet authority over lands seized in 1939. In exchange, Poland would absorb parts of eastern Germany, shifting its border to the Oder-Neisse line. Churchill and Roosevelt, reluctant to provoke Stalin, consented as long as free elections took place in Poland and elsewhere, an assurance swiftly undermined by the rise of pro-communist regimes across Eastern Europe. The Declaration on Liberated Europe aimed to guarantee self-determination, but its vagueness granted Stalin wide latitude. Meanwhile, plans to try Nazi war criminals gained momentum, foreshadowing the Nuremberg trials. In a secret protocol, Stalin promised to declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In return, he obtained southern Sakhalin, the Kurils, and influence in Manchuria, redefining Asia's map. Though Yalta outwardly signaled Allied cooperation, distrust deepened. Churchill feared Soviet expansionism, Roosevelt's health was waning, and Stalin, emboldened by the Red Army's momentum, felt unstoppable. These precarious agreements lit the fuse for an East-West rift even before the World War ended. Barely 2 months after Yalta, the world was shaken by President Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, a quiet locale in the American Southeast. Having led the nation through the Great Depression and nearly all of World War II, FDR had become an iconic figure at home and abroad. With his passing, Vice President Harry S. Truman, less seasoned in high-stakes diplomacy, assumed the role of commander-in-chief. His tougher stance toward Stalin significantly influenced the upcoming Potsdam Conference and the post-war landscape. In July 1945, after Nazi Germany's surrender, Winston Churchill suffered a dramatic electoral defeat to Clement Attlee. Churchill did attend the start of the Potsdam Conference, which opened on July 17, but he was compelled to return to London on July 26, when the election results confirmed a Labour victory. In his place, Attlee took over negotiations for the second phase of the meeting. Only Joseph Stalin remained from the original Big Three of Tehran and Yalta, now joined by Harry S. Truman and Attlee in Potsdam, near Berlin, within the Soviet occupation zone. Here, they formally confirmed Germany's division into 4 sectors, as well as Berlin's partition under the Allied Control Council. Fierce debates erupted over reparations. The USSR demanded heavy compensation from Eastern Germany, while the Western Allies, mindful of Versailles, urged restraint. Deciding Poland's western boundary was crucial. By provisionally approving the Oder-Neisse line, Silesia, Pomerania, and large parts of East Prussia passed to Poland, forcing millions of Germans from their homes. Königsberg, later Kaliningrad, went to the USSR, redrawing Central Europe. The Foreign Ministers' Council was formed to prepare peace treaties with Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland, and to devise a final plan for Germany. Austria remained occupied and administered separately. During Potsdam, Truman received news of the stunning success of the atomic bomb test at Los Alamos, stifling his resolve. The conference concluded with the Potsdam Declaration, delivering Japan an ultimatum of conditional surrender or prompt and utter destruction. After Potsdam, Central and Eastern Europe underwent sweeping transformations. Under Allied administration, Germany would split into West Germany, American, British, and French zones, and East Germany, Soviet zone. Berlin, lying deep in Soviet-held territory, remained divided, its western sectors an island inside East Germany. Having surrendered its eastern lands to the USSR, Poland gained Silesia, Pomerania, and parts of East Prussia under the Odense deal, expelling millions of Germans. Farther north, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania stayed under Soviet rule. As the Foreign Ministers' Council negotiated with the Axis's former partners, Austria, though previously annexed, remained occupied separately, awaiting restored independence. Simultaneously, the Allies advanced war crimes proceedings, culminating at Nuremberg. In mere months, borders shifted, populations were displaced, and Europe's structure was recast. These upheavals paved the way for decades of East-West rivalry. While Europe was carved into occupation zones, Asia, too, faced sweeping post-war realignments. The Soviet Union annexed southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands from Japan, fulfilling Yalta's terms. Korea was split along the 38th parallel, entrenching a permanent rift between a Soviet-backed north and a US-supported south. In China, Soviet troops withdrew from Manchuria, leaving a vacuum that reignited civil war. Meanwhile, European efforts to reclaim Indochina and the Dutch East Indies sparked fierce independence movements. These redrawings sowed the seeds of future conflicts, from the Korean War to anti-colonial revolutions. Within a year of Potsdam, on March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill visited Fulton, Missouri, and delivered a speech that shattered any illusions of Allied unity. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, he declared. This dramatic proclamation publicly affirmed the rift between the Western democracies and the Soviet-dominated East. Churchill's words reverberated worldwide. By defining the Soviet bloc as a cordoned-off realm, he effectively codified the East-West divide. Although tensions had been simmering over Poland, occupation zones, and the absence of free elections in the East, this moment made the fault line undeniable. The era of Allied cooperation ended, yielding a bipolar world soon governed by nuclear arsenals and ideological battles. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech exposed just how fragile that peace really was. Summer 1948. Every 90 seconds, a plane touched down in West Berlin. Over 1,400 flights in a single day, more than 700 aircraft involved, and 20,000 people committed to an unprecedented logistical feat. With Soviet forces blocking all routes to the city, over 2 million civilians were left isolated, surrounded by the blockade. How did they survive a total shutdown? And how was one of history's greatest relief operations ever organized? In the aftermath of 1945, Germany lay in ruins, carved up among the four victorious powers. Even Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was likewise split into four sectors. With cities leveled, factories in rubble, and hunger rampant, millions faced an uncertain future. With Europe's cities gutted and markets in disarray, the entire continent teetered on collapse. In the West, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, investing around $13 billion, worth over $150 billion today, to revive the shattered economies of Western Europe. Convinced that free markets were essential for stability, American and Western European leaders focused on rebuilding infrastructure and restoring trade. In West Germany, these funds jump-started reconstruction in the Ruhr and other industrial regions, spurring the repair of roads, warehouses, and vital services. The goal was clear: create a strong, self-sufficient market economy able to withstand new crises. Beyond the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union practiced a planned economy, strict state control, fixed quotas, and rapid heavy industry development. To Stalin, Western aid was a means to fortify capitalism on the doorstep of Eastern Europe, undermining socialism and Soviet security. The clash between market and state planning made post-war Germany a flashpoint of ideological tension. For Stalin, economic growth in the West directly threatened the socialist bloc. For Washington, meanwhile, European prosperity was both a moral duty and a strategic bulwark against communism. Thus emerged a tense East-West rivalry whose focal point would be Berlin. The United States, Britain, and France, bolstered by Marshall Plan aid, introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, designed to jumpstart the economy and replace the Reichsmark, which runaway inflation had rendered nearly worthless. In Frankfurt, the Bank Deutscher Länder swiftly began printing and distributing these new banknotes, laying the groundwork for the city's future global financial prominence. But when the Deutschmark also reached West Berlin, Soviet leaders in Moscow watched it spread with growing alarm. From their perspective, a capitalist and prosperous Germany, ever closer to Western powers, threatened Soviet authority in the region. Determined to halt this westward drift, the Soviets condemned the new currency as a breach of wartime accords. According to the Kremlin, the Allies were effectively forging a unified, capitalist West Germany, utterly at odds with Stalin's plan for a socialist buffer state. To prevent West Berlin from becoming a visible sign of Western prosperity in the heart of the Soviet zone, Moscow tightened its grip. It was the start of one of the earliest and most emblematic crises of the Cold War. In June 1948, the Soviet Union abruptly cut all rail, road, and water routes to West Berlin, effectively isolating the city from the Allied-controlled zones. Among the severed connections was the Helmstedt-Marienborn corridor, vital for supplies. Even on the Elbe River, new checkpoints paralyzed navigation and blocked coal shipments. Simultaneously, the Soviets sharply reduced electricity flow, worsening an already dire situation. Their intent was clear: deny more than 2 million Berliners every resource, hoping that Britain, France, and the United States would be forced to abandon West Berlin, which Moscow viewed as part of its own sphere of influence. For the population, this was a desperate time. With roads sealed and no way to bring in essential goods, many braced for a winter of hunger and despair. Some Berliners attempted makeshift solutions, yet supplies dwindled rapidly, fueling mounting fear and uncertainty. Allies recognized that quitting West Berlin would signal defeat and embolden further Soviet ambitions. Soviet authorities believed the Allies would never risk a direct confrontation and would simply withdraw. Yet in the West, various options were considered. At one point, leaders even weighed breaking the blockade by land, using military convoys along the Helmstedt-Marienborn corridor, the only highway connecting West Germany to Berlin. Diplomacy was also explored as a safer path, though it would have required significant political compromises. Ultimately, the boldest solution prevailed, supplying Berlin entirely by air, using flight rights that still applied from World War II. From a logistical standpoint, it seemed nearly impossible, but it had one decisive advantage: it avoided a direct military clash. Defying every prediction, Allied resolve won out. They chose not to abandon Berlin, launching what would become history's most ambitious airlift, an unparalleled operation still remembered today as one of the most emblematic episodes of the early Cold War. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet blockade sealed off more than 2 million Berliners. Just 2 days later, on June 26, the airlift officially began. At first, Allied C-47s carried around 2,000 tons a day, far too little to supply even 1,800 daily calories per person. Fuel shortages set in, the cold became pressing, and blackouts were frequent. Yet soon, the Allies introduced larger aircraft. The Americans used the C-54, while the British deployed the Arvo York and the Handley Page Hastings. Flight volume steadily increased, delivering not only food and medical supplies, but also the coal needed for heating and public utilities. As the effort grew, Operation Vittles became a tangible symbol of Western resolve. Berlin would not be abandoned. From the very start of Operation Vittles, or Operation Plainfare, as the British called it, military planners estimated that each Berliner required at least 1,800 to 2,000 calories a day, plus coal for heating and power generation. Their initial target was ambitious: 3,500 tons a day. Yet in the coldest months, that figure proved insufficient, ramping up logistical pressure. Even small outposts like Marker played a surprisingly big part. Though barely passable, certain back roads channeled Marshall Plan resources to local depots, which then trucked supplies to main bases. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, people grappled with strict rationing and continuous blackouts. Many spent the winter without heat, subsisting on fewer than 1,800 calories a day and living in constant fear of running out of essentials. Despite these daunting hardships, hopes remained alive that a resolute airlift would keep Berlin's spirit unbroken. In the initial weeks, chaos prevailed. The 3 Allied air corridors, each about 20 miles wide, were not yet managed in sync, and Tempelhof's landing schedules frequently overlapped. Officially, 2 corridors, northern and central, handled inbound flights from northern and central West Germany, while the southern one, from Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, handled flights exiting Berlin. In mid-July 1948, an event occurred that would become one of the operation's most beloved symbols. Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen, after a supply flight, gave a few chocolate bars to a group of children behind Tempelhof's fence. Moved by their delight, he began dropping candy with small cloth parachutes, creating the candy bombers. Though just a tiny part of the colossal logistics operation, that gesture brought real hope to the people, especially the youngest. Spurred by Halvorsen's example, more pilots joined in, lifting morale even citywide. General Lucius D. Clay, aware that the current system could never supply Berlin's needs, turned the operation over to William H. Tunner, a logistics expert renowned for running the perilous Hump airlift over the Himalayas in World War II. Tunner took command on July 28, 1948, intent on boosting transport to unheard-of levels. He restructured the 3 flight corridors, 2 inbound and 1 outbound, and introduced staggered altitudes to prevent collisions and allow landings every 3 minutes, day and night. Planes bound for Berlin entered the northern or central corridor at scheduled times and altitudes, choosing their route based on cargo. If the runway was in use, pilots flew a transition level before landing at Tempelhof, Gatow, or the new Tegel airfield, built at breakneck speed in November 1948. Crews unloaded in 20 to 30 minutes, then departed via the southern corridor. This precise rotation allowed multiple aircraft to fly without snarls. Under Tunner's direction, West German bases, Rhine-Main near Frankfurt, and Wiesbaden sped up loading. The British operated from Vosburg, Wunsdorf, and Celle, transporting coal, while in Berlin's British sector, short Sunderland and short height seaplanes brought in salt without corroding cargo holds. The RAF expanded Gatow, and in the French sector, Tegel opened, reducing bottlenecks. By August 1948, daily tonnage surpassed 3,500, ensuring vital supplies despite blackouts and long lines. The candy bombers reminded everyone that relief truly came from the sky. Once logistics solidified, capacity rose sharply. By autumn, C-54 Skymasters replaced many Dakotas, raising totals above 5,000 tons a day. Soon, they exceeded 8,000, finally peaking at 12,941 tons on April 16, 1949, the famous Easter Parade. At that point, Berlin could rely on an emergency reserve. Tunner's reforms, grounded in innovation, transformed aerial logistics. Crews mastered schedules, ground teams ran shifts, and controllers guided wave after wave of incoming flights. Efficiency soared, underscoring the Allies' unwavering commitment to save the city. After almost a year of non-stop flights, the airlift proved an effective answer to Soviet pressure. On May 12, 1949, Stalin was forced to reopen land routes, yet the Allies kept flying until late September to bolster supplies. Altogether, around 277,000 flights were made, delivering over 2 million tons of aid. The operation's success turned Berlin into a symbol of Western resolve. Soon afterward, West Germany became the Federal Republic, with Bonn as its capital, while East Germany formed as the Democratic Republic, centered in East Berlin. Over the next 4 decades, West Berlin's airspace remained under tight Western Allied control, following the 1945 four-power agreements that granted only the United States, the United Kingdom, and France the right to operate military and civilian flights to and from West Berlin. Other airlines, including German carriers like Lufthansa, were barred until reunification. Only after the wall fell on October 28, 1990, could Lufthansa run its first official Berlin flight, symbolically ending an era when air corridors stood as a Cold War frontier. This milestone affirmed reunification and closed a chapter of aerial access. China's Great Wall was built to halt Mongol invaders. Hadrian's Wall contained northern tribes. The walls of Jerusalem, Constantinople, and every city in history stood to defend against enemies at the gate. Yet, in 1961, Berlin erected a wall unlike any other, the Berlin Wall. For the first time in history, a wall was not about keeping enemies out, but about locking its own people in, a prison that changed history. Why would a government barricade a city from within? What drove the USSR and East Germany to seal Berlin overnight, fully and irrevocably transforming it into an open-air prison? Why did that wall have to exist, and what was it truly defending? After the Berlin Airlift, tensions in Europe soared. Germany was carved up among the four victorious powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Even Berlin, though within the Soviet zone, was split into four sectors. In 1949, two German states emerged: the Federal Republic of Germany, supported by NATO and the Marshall Plan, and the German Democratic Republic, allied with the USSR. It was the start of the Cold War. Berlin became the conflict symbol. In the West, a city reborn. In the East, a socialist regime. With the Iron Curtain drawn, rivalry between superpowers ignited across Europe. Meanwhile, the Cold War had ceased to be an ideological duel. In 1950, the Korean War erupted, the first true proxy conflict between East and West. On one side stood the Communist North, backed by the USSR and China, which dispatched nearly 1 million volunteers. On the other, the South, supported by the United Nations and led by the United States, mobilizing over 1.7 million troops. 21 UN countries took part, turning the Korean Peninsula into a battleground and a symbol of each bloc's resolve. In Berlin, fear of another global war spread swiftly. Thousands of East German citizens began fleeing westward. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 500,000 people crossed Berlin to reach the Federal Republic of Germany. No walls, no impenetrable blockade. Crossing an administrative boundary, using fake documents, or simply boarding a train to West Berlin was enough. The socialist government lost workers, technicians, doctors, teachers, and especially ambitious youth. Official propaganda labeled them traitors, yet the flow did not slow. Soon, East German leaders would conclude that only far more drastic measures could halt it. This exodus revealed the GDR's vulnerability, undermining its credibility at home and abroad. In 1952, to stem the flow westward, the German Democratic Republic decided to seal its entire land border with the Federal Republic of Germany, over 800 miles from the Baltic coast near Lübeck down to the Hof area. Barbed wire, barriers, and armed watchtowers staffed by the Grenztruppen were erected. Anyone trying to cross through forests, fields, or rural stretches of Lower Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia risked landmines, patrols, and gunfire. Yet Berlin remained an exception. The boundary between East and West was still formal, with few checkpoints, open roads, and an easily traversable frontier. Precisely that anomaly turned Berlin into the leading escape route for Eastern citizens. While the rest of the Iron Curtain became ever more impregnable, the city's urban border stayed porous. Each day, thousands freely crossed both sectors. From the regime's viewpoint, Berlin was becoming a dangerous gateway to freedom, one that needed to be shut as soon as possible. Its open streets stood out as a loophole amid an otherwise fortified frontier. prompting urgent action. In May 1955, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance that included East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. This bloc directly challenged Western NATO, formalizing Europe's military split into two armed spheres set for confrontation. The GDR's entry bolstered the Soviet presence in the region and reinforced Moscow's sway over East Germany's armed forces and internal policy. In October 1956, Hungary rose up against its communist regime, seeking liberation from Soviet authority. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the revolt by force. Over 2,500 people were killed, and thousands of Hungarians fled westward. That massacre revealed to the entire Eastern Bloc how far the USSR would go to defend its system, no matter the cost. In East Berlin, the GDR leadership vividly recalled the June 17, 1953 uprising. Thousands of workers had protested rising production quotas and the regime's harsh conditions. The protests began at Stalin-Alley work sites, but spread citywide within hours. Not only workers, but ordinary citizens, wary of restrictions and propaganda, took to the streets. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. Tanks rolled in, dozens were killed, and thousands arrested. That crackdown left a deep scar, proving to East Berliners that dissent carried a dire price. Fear now loomed across East Berlin, where memories of violent suppression stifled dissent, underscoring the extent of Soviet resolve to maintain control in the GDR, whatever the consequences. In October 1957, a technological breakthrough shook the West. The USSR launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, igniting what Americans would dub the Sputnik shock. Suddenly, Moscow's ability to send an object into orbit signaled the capacity to build long-range missiles capable of striking anywhere in the Western Bloc. It was a jarring psychological blow, demonstrating a Soviet technological edge amid the Cold War. In 1958, buoyed by this momentary advantage, Nikita Khrushchev raised the stakes with an ultimatum. He demanded that the United States, France, and the United Kingdom withdraw from West Berlin, calling it a foreign body in socialist territory. Yet the West stood firm. To yield would have meant abandoning its defensive role at Europe's core. Military and diplomatic presence in West Berlin remained steadfast, and tensions soared, making the city one of the Cold War's most incendiary flashpoints. This standoff underscored the high stakes involved, with Berlin emerging yet again as the epicenter of a global confrontation. As the USSR kept expanding its reach, a new factor pushed tensions sky high. In 1959, Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba, bringing communism just a few miles from U.S. shores. Soon after, in 1960, the Soviets managed to shoot down an American U-2 spy plane near Sverdlovsk in the Urals, thus revealing the United States had been running high-altitude surveillance missions inside the communist bloc. Capturing the pilot dealt a blow to Western credibility, further fueling mistrust between the two superpowers. Meanwhile, in East Berlin, the exodus showed no sign of abating. In 1960 alone, over 200,000 people crossed the city's border into West Berlin. Among them, doctors, engineers, teachers, and other skilled workers. This mass departure undercut East Germany's economy and exposed its ideological frailty, while propaganda tried to hide the issue or brand defectors as traitors. This surge laid bare the emptiness behind socialist promises, prompting East German authorities to tighten border measures while publicly downplaying the crisis, and no official explanation sufficed. Complicating matters, Berlin felt almost surreal. Though technically in Eastern territory, West Berlin still maintained ties with the West, and even some transport routes that ran beneath areas under Eastern control. Rumor had it that, in those months, certain residents used ghost trains or seldom guarded paths to dodge checkpoints and reunite with family and friends. This showed how difficult it was for the regime to seal the flow entirely, which would grow until the problem became completely unmanageable. In April 1961, the United States backed an attempted landing by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs in a desperate effort to topple Fidel Castro and end the newly established communist government in Cuba. The operation collapsed disastrously, triggering a sharp escalation in tensions between Washington and Moscow. In June of that year, US President John F. Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. Their face-to-face was laden with mistrust and yielded no compromise. Kennedy reiterated that the United States would never abandon Berlin, seen as a bastion of freedom in a Europe fractured by the Cold War. Meanwhile, NATO increased its contingents in West Germany. During those years, Kennedy strengthened America's bond with West Berlin's population, culminating in his famous June 1963 visit when he proclaimed the iconic phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner, to underscore the West's solidarity with the divided city. Yet by 1961, the GDR leadership, under the USSR's hardline guidance, was planning a drastic solution to stem the outflow of fleeing citizens, the total closure of West Berlin, which would become one of the most dramatic chapters in Germany's history, the Berlin Wall. On the night of August 12 through 13, 1961, everything changed forever. GDR soldiers, police, and workers encircled West Berlin with barbed wire, blocking roads and rail lines. In under 48 hours, the city was abruptly sealed off, with dozens of miles of barriers slicing through neighborhoods and families. The evening before, many Berliners had gone to sleep oblivious. By morning, phones and transport links were cut. Entire districts literally split in two. The psychological impact was enormous. In a single day, a once unified city became two separate worlds. Those temporary fences soon gave way to a concrete wall that, upon completion, stretched over 96 miles, studded with more than 300 guard towers and a death strip up to 100 meters wide in places, equipped with trenches, fences, and firing positions. In the following years, more than 5,000 people attempted to flee, yet at least 140 lost their lives in the desperate dash for freedom. It was the most tangible symbol of a global order built on division and fear. The Berlin Wall remained in place for 28 years, dividing not just the city, but the entire world between East and West. From the night of August 13, 1961, until its demise on November 9, 1989, it claimed at least 140 lives among those who tried scaling it. As the starkest symbol of the Cold War, it finally fell under the Berliners' own push on November 9, 1989. If you enjoyed this Cold War narrative, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with fellow history lovers. Thank you for watching.